class, here's part 2 of our parrot watercolor, and in the first video we went and drew this beautiful little parrot together, and now we're going to paint him. And I've gone ahead and I've mixed up some colors here. We need red, yellow, and 2 different kinds of green. You're going to need a darker green and a lighter green and a black. And so I mix them up first so I can have them ready to go. I have 2 glasses of clean water. So one is to rinse my brush out, and the other one is if I need clear water, I have an extra glass. And this is very important when we're doing watercolor because we want our painting to have really bright and vibrant color. And if we're using dirty water to paint with, it will dirty up our painting. So if you want bright, luminous watercolor, you must have clean water and clear water. I also have a variety of brushes here, a large one, a medium one, and a very tiny one, which we are going to use for our detail. So let me start by painting his head. And I want to get this edge going first because I really want that edge to dry before I paint the background. So I'm going to go into my red, and I've tested my colors out on a scrap paper. You should do that too. And I always have a paper towel nearby just in case I need to touch a little paint off or see what the color is looking like. So I'm going to come in here and put this edge in. And I'm using a pretty big brush, but you guys at home can use whatever brush you have. I just want kind of a jagged line, and I want it to just start drying pretty quickly here. So I'll just come in and try and stay in my lines, but our little parrot's going to have kind of a mohawk going here, spiky head, and I'm just going to bring that paint right down to the edge where we did our line for his beak. And you see, if I'm using a big brush, I can get a lot of paint in the brush, and I can almost paint the whole section in one go here, which is kind of nice for watercolor because where you start your painting is where going to be the darkest and brightest colors, and as we go down and pull the paint, it has this beautiful kind of lighter color that happens. So I don't want to mess with it too much when I put my wash down. I want it to just dry naturally. I'm going to go ahead and just rinse out that brush right now. I want to thin out my paint just a little bit for the next part. So I'm going to come in now and do his back, and I want to be very careful not to get paint on that beak, because remember, our beak is going over the back of our parrot. And I'm just going to come in and paint a little of the ways down. I don't want to go all the way down because we're going to blend some yellows and some green. So about that far. And I'm going to come in and make this a little darker right here. So I'm putting a little more paint. And it's pretty watery. I'm painting what we call pretty loose. So watery. And again, you just want to let it set. Paint it and then let it go. Don't touch it. If you keep going back over and over again, you're going to ruin that beautiful magic that happens with watercolor. So get in there, paint it, and then stop messing with it. All right, so now I'm going to switch into my yellow while this edge is still wet. And it's important when you're mixing 2 colors that you stay away from it at first here. So I'm going to put some yellow in, and I'm leaving a gap just so I'll have some bright yellows. And then you'll see as I carry on here, now I'm going to go into that red edge and just mix them a little bit with my brush. And you want to do this while that edge of the red is still wet. Otherwise you get really harsh lines. So another way to have this kind of happen naturally is to wet your watercolor paper first. So I'm going to just pull in a little bit of this red here, and then I'm going to kind of pull down some of the red to give it a little bit of a feathery look, right? So that's it. Now I'm going to let them dry. I'm not going to mess with that yellow and red anymore. And now I'm going to go into the bottom of my parrot, which is the green, and I'm going to use my lighter of the 2 greens. So I have a very kind of appley, yellowy green. That's a technical term, appley green. And I find that that's a little light, so I'm going to add a little more pigment to my wash. There we go. Make him nice and bright here. And the same technique, I'm going to go almost up into that yellow, and I'm going to rinse out my brush so I get all that green out. And I have 2 cups of water, so I can go one to get all the paint out and the other to make it nice and clear. So you see my brush is absolutely clean, and I'm going to pull those 2 colors together while the edge of that yellow paint is still wet. And I'm just going to pull a little bit of that yellow down and a little bit of the green up. And then I'm going to come down all the way to the edge of my paper and off the edge, like that. Now he's looking pretty cute. And at this point, he's still damp. I'm going to go into my darker green, and I've mixed up a nice dark, and we'll call this swamp green. My, what class was I painting with? I'm trying to remember now. That was so long ago. I think it was Mrs. Boyko's class. We were doing colored pencils. That's what it was. Guys, do you remember everyone was looking for the swamp green? I think it was Mrs. Boyko's. You'll have to send me an email and remind me if I have the wrong class. There was one class that was obsessed with this one green pencil I had, and they were all calling it swamp green. But anyway, so I put a little bit of this darker green at the bottom. So you see how he has a nice fade, and I want to be careful not to pull my green up into my reds. So I'm just going to let that set for a minute, and I'm letting him dry. And the whole time I'm doing this, I'm talking to you guys, and while I'm talking, my painting is drying. So if you're at home, this is the point where you just walk away, right? Go get a cookie, have a snack, do your math homework, whatever it is you need to do. And then come back to it once it's dry. I'm going to rush it a little bit because I don't want to break this up into too many videos, and I'm going to go ahead and paint the background. But you guys at home, if you're watercoloring, this is the point where you pause and you go do something and come back when it's dry, because I don't want you to get the green into your feathers here. So I'm going to start at the top, since I think that's probably dry. And I'm going to go in with my green that I made here, this kind of appley green. And I'm going to add a little water to it just to lighten it up a little bit. So it's not quite as dramatic as the green at the bottom here. So I'm going to test them out right here. Yep, that looks good. And I'm going to just start at the top. And I'm going to just fill in this whole area with green. And anytime we're doing a large area, you really do want to move fast. Not so fast that you're getting over the top of your painting, but fast enough that your watercolor is not drying on you. And this is one reason I love using really thick watercolor paper, is that you can really put a lot of paint on it and it'll just absorb. So every time I stop painting this edge right here, when I stop painting there, it's now drying. So I have to go back and get it wet, because I don't want it to be a sharp edge. I want a nice, beautiful wash without any jagged edges. So you really want to work your way around here while it's still wet, always moving that wet edge down. And so I kind of work my way back and forth. And see, now his back wasn't quite dry and it's wicking in, but we'll see what it looks like. Hopefully you waited long enough at home that it won't do that. That's kind of neat, actually. I'll just put a little more green there. We'll see what happens. It kind of has a shadowy effect. And isn't that just the beauty of watercolor? You never know what's going to happen when you're painting. It's always kind of magical. And as long as you try and keep your paints nice and clean, and you don't use dirty, muddy water, then we'll have bright, beautiful paintings. Okay, so now while this is still wet, right, you can see my paper is really curled up, hasn't it? I'm going to go into my dark green now, and I'm just going to touch the paper and think about the jungle, right? What do the leaves look like in the background behind our little parrot? Because he's in the wild here. He's not a parrot in a cage. So I'm just going into my dark greens. I'm going to pull in a few of this darker color. It'll have sharper edges here at the top where it's already started to dry. You can see how the edges aren't blending as much as down here where it's wet. And that's just something that happens there with watercolor. If you didn't want that to happen, you'd have to be really fast. And so let's see, maybe I'll make some really darker green here, and I'm just gonna put some real dark greens down at the bottom. I'm trying to stay away from my bird. I don't really want too much of this really dark swamp green on him. And that's wonderful, just like that. So I'm gonna clean my brush out. And again, I go into my first glass, get all the color out, and then my second glass is just clear water. Now I have a really clean brush. And that is the key to beautiful watercolor. So I'm going to take my yellow and I'm going to just lighten it up a little bit because this yellow is pretty bright. And I'm going to get some of that paint off my brush by just touching it on my paper towel here. And I'm going to paint this little section right here next to his face and just the top of the beak here. Now my green is pretty wet, so I'm going to avoid that edge as best I can here. And I'm going to paint that yellow, and then I'm going to water it down even more. So you want a lot of water and a little bit of yellow. So it's just a touch of yellow, and I'm just going to come in and just put a little tiny little yellow glow right here. And you see it's mostly water at this point, just the tiniest bit of yellow. And while that's drying, I'm going to switch to a tiny brush. So I have this little guy right here, and I've made up some black. Hopefully it's nice dark black. I haven't tested that one. Maybe it needs to be a little darker. So get a really nice black. And a tiny brush if you have one. And I'm going to paint the center of his eye, just like that. Try and do your best to stay inside your lines. I know that's always a challenge. And then we're going to give him a little bit of eyeliner, right? That gives it a dimension. So just on the bottom side of his eye here. And if you don't have a tiny brush, you can put this in with a marker or a colored pencil or whatever you have at home that's black. And then I'm going to switch back to a little bit bigger brush here to do his beak. And we're still doing black. I'm just going to get some black on my brush here. I'm going to go in right here on this edge of this beak, and I'm going to color that beak in. Just like that. And again, I'm doing the best I can to stay inside my lines. It'll wick a little bit into your face, and that's perfectly okay. You want to take your time between painting layers. I'm just making this edge a little darker. So I went back in and got more black, so it has a nice shaded effect. And then I'm going to come in here. My yellow's still wet, and that's okay. I'm going to paint this edge like that. And then I'm going to just get clear water, just like we did down here where we switched colors. So I'm cleaning my brush out. I have nothing on my brush but water, and I dried it off a little bit. And I'm just going to come and just gently touch that edge, just so the black pulls up into the yellow, just like that. So you see it kind of does a magical watercolory edge there. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to switch back to my red and my tiny brush, and I'm probably rushing this just a little bit because I did this yellow wash on his face. So at home, maybe you want to blow on it a little bit and let it dry. But I'm going to take my red, and as carefully as I can, I'm going to paint over those little lines that we did. And this is pretty dark red, so it should hide my pencil lines. If you want, again, you can use your colored pencil or a marker if you don't have a tiny brush. Don't use a giant brush for this. Find a different way. So I'm just going to come in. And I have a feeling that these bottom ones might blur a little bit because the paper is wet here, but I think it might be interesting to see what happens. So there we go. And I'm just going to come in with my red and do a little feather texture here. So now I have a fairly dry painting. I'm going to do some feathering. And then in the back here, I want to make it darker. So I'm going to do my second glaze, right? So when you have a wash down and it's dry, you can go over it again with the same color, and that's called glazing. And that's how we add darker color in areas that we want a little darker color. And I'm just going to gently bring in the red down here just to show his red feathers have kind of wrapped around his body here, and making it a little bit jagged because I want to give him that feeling of featherness, right? He has little feathers. So I'm just going to do the same on the edge here. Make it a little darker. Just define that edge. And down here, I'm going to do a little bit. I'm going to be very careful not to touch my beak because I don't want the black to pull into his body here. And I really like the way that's looking. So now I'm going to do some texturing up on the top of his head. So I'm going to come in and just give him some little feathers here. Just like that. So I'm going right over that initial wash with some red. And you notice how I'm pulling my brush in the direction the feathers kind of are on him naturally. And that is important because we want to always go with the flow of the way the body on the animal is. Even if we're doing hair for people, it's the same thing. You want it to go the same direction it is in nature. And there you have it. I think that's good. This is our little watercolor parrot. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please keep continuing to send me your emails. I love seeing your pictures, and I miss you guys so much. So all those messages that you send me mean so much to me. So keep sending them to me, and I look forward to seeing your art this week. Thanks.